as many of you know, I actually have two backgrounds in archaeology, and one seems very obvious to most people who know me today, that I focus on the American Southwest, right? In addition to being the manager of Coronado and Jemez Historic Sites, I'm also the president of the Archaeological Society of New Mexico. I actually focus on two different regions, though. And the other region I tend to focus on is Central Europe during a time period that is often referred to as the early Middle Ages. And we'll be talking specifically about what my research is in Central or Eastern Europe in the next lecture. But for today, I want to talk about the period kind of leading up to where I jump in on my research. And that period is often known as the era of late antiquity. It's a time period I'm very passionate about, and I feel that a lot of people ignore entirely. You'll notice that many of the historical figures in this talk that I'm about to give are the names of also my children, in that I've named my children after figures during late antiquity. I find it a very colorful time, a time of a very different kind of than our preconceived notions. And I think this is the perfect example to lead off a discussion of late antiquity. Here we see the Roman emperor bowing before the Persian Shah of the Sassanid Empire in a relief, a statuesque relief in the Middle East today. This dates back to the crisis of the 3rd century. So the term late antiquity was popularized by Peter Brown in 1971. The term was kind of floating around before that time, but it wasn't very much well used. So people of generations older than me may not have even heard of the term late antiquity. And it's usually used as a term to delineate the transition between the classical world or antiquity to the Middle Ages. And it's usually used only in terms of Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and including portions of North Africa and the Horn of Africa. Though sometimes it's also used to refer to China and India, but it's really the period from about the 3rd through the 8th century. So from about AD 200 to AD 800. And this was a time of profound change in Western and Middle Eastern culture. There's a lot of other names it goes by. In fact, the name that you guys probably heard as growing up was probably the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages or even the Migration period. Those are very common names applied in Northern Europe. You'll hear those used today. In Eastern Asia, it goes by a lot of different names. In Korea, it's known as the Three Kingdoms period. In Japan, it's the Kofun period, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. In sub-Saharan Africa, we talked a little bit about Africa in some of the earlier talks. It's part of this larger Iron Age. Late antiquity is sometimes used for China and India, but I cannot cover those areas in this lecture, primarily because we're only talking an hour here, and that would just be too much to cover. Also, I honestly believe, and I've tried in several occasions, talking about the history of India. I love it, but it's one of the most challenging regions to discuss during this period, because we tend to think of India as not a subcontinent, but almost as a state in and of itself, But reality is the subcontinent of India was home to many different states during this period. So what are our presentation goals? Well, our first presentation goal is to examine the great empires of late antiquity, primarily Roman and Sassanid empires. And then we're going to talk about the new ethnic groups which rise to prominence during this period. And then lastly, we're going to end with the emergence of Islam as both a political and religious movement that kind of ends the era and what that means for the end of antiquity. It's important to note that while we tend to think of Christianity as a defining moment in Western civilization, Christianity developed within this entire time period of antiquity, whereas Islam really made the cultures and attitudes and ideas that came before it, really just shut them down, turned it into something entirely new. And I'm going to make that argument through this talk. So let's go on to the next slide. Okay, So if you're going to talk about late antiquity, it really starts with the crisis in the 3rd century. The Emperor Severus of the Roman Empire dies, and the Roman Empire goes through a great decline. In fact, by most modern day historian standards, the Roman Empire should have collapsed in the 3rd century. It should not have existed past this time period. It was facing a lot of problems, economics, religious, civil war amongst the Romans. In fact, during the crisis of the 3rd century, as you see on this map here, the Roman Empire actually split into 3 units. You have the Gallic Empire in green, you have what was the actual Roman Empire in red, and then you had something known as the Palmyrene Empire in the east, which is in yellow. And so these divisions broke off, and the Roman Empire looked like it was just going to collapse for a variety of reasons, but it didn't. But during this time period, perhaps the most shocking thing, and we started with that slide that showed a Sassanid relief of it, is in the spring of AD 260, the Roman army was actually destroyed by the Sassanid Empire at the Battle of Edessa. The Sassanids rode out, and you can see this is a modern day representation. Obviously, you can see the fallen Roman shield on the ground, and you have the Sassanids riding off into battle with their heavy horsemen known as Cataphracts. These cavalry that you see here, these heavily armored horsemen. They run down to the Roman army. They capture the Emperor Valerian, who you saw in that motif, bowing before the Persian Empire. And to make things even worse, not only did they kill him, they actually stuffed him and put him on display in a Zoroastrian temple. Now you might say to yourself, I have no idea who the Sassanids are. Well, don't worry, we're going to get there right now. The Sassanid Empire was kind of a counterpoint for the Roman Empire, starting in the crisis of the 3rd century. At about the same time the Roman Empire is falling apart, the Sassanid Empire is emerging. They actually emerge out of an earlier empire known as the Parthians. And the Parthians had been these kind of more nomadic peoples from up on the Pontic steppe that had come to rule portions of Persia. But with the Sassanid dynasty, which is also sometimes known as the Neo-Persian dynasty, the Iranian plateau and the Persian peoples kind of returned, or believed that they returned to old Achaemenid times. So when you hear the old stories of the Greeks versus the Persians, the Sassanid Empire of Persia really thought that they were the spiritual successor of Darius and Cyrus and all the great Persian emperors of old times that had been destroyed by Alexander the Great. They thought they were recreating their empire on earth. And if you can see here, this is kind of the extent of their empire. You'll notice those areas kind of in a striped pattern. Those represent the areas that at times were part of the Roman Empire and at times were part of the Sassanid Empire. Those are areas they fought over constantly. But if you look at the greater part of this new Neo-Persian Empire, it's centered in the modern day countries of Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, Yemen, portions of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, a very, very large area, even heading up into the Himalaya Mountains, and into almost the Indian subcontinent. So into what it would be modern day Pakistan. Their primary soldier of power were these cataphracts. This is a reproduction of what a cataphract looked like, these heavily armored guys. They had existed during Achaemenid times, the earlier Persian Empire, but were in small numbers. And the Sassanids really took this idea of the cataphract and they really built upon his armor. You'll notice he's wearing like a chainmail, and his horse has either a version of scale or lamellar armor on him. Over time, this would come to cover the entire rider and the horse. And if this looks a little bit similar to the Christian knight of the Middle Ages, this is where all that stuff derives from. In fact, once the Sassanids started to employ these guys in large numbers, the Romans actually gave up on a lot of their infantry and started to employ these guys. So this kind of heavily armored horsemen, which would form the basis of both the later Christian knight in the Islamic Mamluk, really derives from this Persian Sassanid Empire. The Sassanids were also rather interesting because they practiced a religion known as Zoroastrianism. It's an ancient religion of Persia. It's a sort of a monotheistic religion with the supreme deity being Ahura Mazda. And yes, Mazda, the car company, that's where the name comes from. He's the supreme deity of this early Persian, this pre-Islamic Persian state. And they really focused on the triumph of good versus evil. And their primary focus, in fact, if you went into a Zoroastrian temples, and there are some Zoroastrians today, really religion and worship is focused on these eternal fires. They're sometimes embrasures, like you see here, and it has the fire represents the light, represents good, the darkness represents evil, and so on and so forth. In this religion, actually, there's a lot of more scholarly studies now that suggested it really inspired major changes in Judaism and in the development of later Christianity and Islam. So even though it is not a technically one of the biblical religions per se, it certainly inspired a lot of that for a lot of people. But the crisis ends. So these Sassanids are going around and they do some horrible things to the Romans, but the Romans pull it together. They pull it together under a guy known as the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian decides that the empire it can't fall apart. So instead of it being 3 separate states, he decides to actually separate. It's one state, one empire, but it's ruled by 4 separate emperors, and it's known as a tetrarchy. He creates this idea that Rome's going to be ruled by 4 men who are going to work in the best interest of Rome. And of course, none of that lasts. In fact, as we move into the 4th century, a man by the name of Constantine decides that he can rule the entire empire. And in fact, that's not Diocletian there, that's Constantine that I'm showing a picture of. I just recognized who it was. Constantine was the first Christian emperor. His rule actually marks the transition of the Roman Empire from a Latin-speaking pagan state centered in Rome. And it should be noted that under the Tetrarchy, the capital of Rome, the Roman Empire, was not Rome starting in the 3rd century. The actual, when Constantine took charge, we like to say he moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople in his own image. But really, the capital of the Roman Empire when Constantine took charge in the west was Milan, and in the east it was Izmit. Those places were known as, and I'm going to probably butcher this, Milan was known as Melodunum or something close to that, and Izmit was known as Nicomedia or something close to that. But he decided that he needed one center for his state. And he chose Byzantium, but he also chose, his rule also brought about the Christian religion as the religion of the empire, as well as a pivot from Latin-speaking empire to a Greek-speaking empire. Byzantium was actually, it's close to Greece. It's actually northeast of Greece nowadays. It's actually part of Turkey today. Now, the Byzantine Empire is a word we use today. It's not a term. If you asked somebody in the 4th, 5th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries what the Byzantine Empire was, they would have no idea what you were talking about. However, if you told them in the 13th century, if you told a Frenchman, well, I want to go visit the Roman Empire, he would have said, oh, so you want to go to Constantinople, you want to go see the Greeks. It was just kind of confusing for us. Remember, the Roman Empire at this point is going to be Greek. Also, the term Byzantine, which is not a term that any of these people would have used for themselves, is now really synonymous with complex and devious. And it really is a word. It's like a slur for this Roman Empire. Of course, what we see here is the Hagia Sophia. Now it's a mosque, but at the time it was the largest and most beautiful Christian church in existence. It's still pretty miraculous today. Once again, the biggest church wasn't in Rome, it was in Constantinople or Byzantium. And there was a practicality to all of this. So that, well, we tend to think of the Roman Empire. If the Roman Empire obviously continues, moving the capital east made sense. Rome wasn't even in the capital when he moved east. Remember, it was Milan. But putting the capital closer to the wealthier cities in the Roman world, which were all in the Middle East, he was able to mobilize armies, easier for campaigns in Persia. It was closer to Persia. Constantine also adopted Christianity, which, as he'd seen with the Persians, was a state religion offered, rather than paganism, offered not only uniformity but centralized authority. One of the things that might be difficult for us in our minds today is that Constantine actually ruled over discussions of what the Christian church believed. So he wasn't just simply following Christian ideas. He was actually crafting what it was to be a Christian. And this makes the emperor not just a secular ruler, but an ecclesiastical one. He had always a justifiable cause for war, because if he was fighting somebody who was non-Christian, if he's the representation of Christianity, that gives him another excuse for war. And then lastly, Greek. The change from Latin to Greek is kind of a no-brainer. Most of the educated people in the Roman Empire, this sounds horrible to say, spoke Greek, not Latin. Greek was a language of trade. And under Alexander the Great, it had spread throughout the Middle East. You could go to Egypt and speak Greek. You could go to the Arabian Peninsula and speak Greek. You could go to Spain and speak Greek. People would understand you. And I know Spain was never even conquered by Alexander. It was a language lots and lots of people knew. Latin was considered less sophisticated. It was considered a language of the West, and not necessarily a language associated with culture. So even though all these people spoke Greek, they didn't refer to themselves as Greeks. They viewed themselves as Romans. But if we take this Sassanid and Roman struggle, it's easy to see the remnants of the classic world. I mean, the classical world had been defined for the West and for the Mediterranean as a conflict between the Greeks and Persians. Persian attacks on Greece had really solidified Greek identity. It had brought culture to the West. The Greeks were the founders of culture. And for many people in this time of late antiquity, they weren't living in such a different time. I mean, the Greeks and the conflict between the Greek and the Persian, in this case, the Roman and Sassanid, was still going strong. These people had always been at war. The world was defined by these two groups of people in conflict with one another, at least to the people living in those empires. However, on the periphery of both the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Empire, life was changing very, very rapidly. In the north, Germanic peoples began to migrate south and west into the Roman Empire. They both fought and collaborated with the Latin and Greek-speaking peoples. They wanted to be part of the empire. And in this process of Germanic peoples moving into the Roman Empire was exacerbated when the Turkic peoples arrived for the first time on the Pontic steppe. They also pushed south, and they pushed the Germans further into the Roman Empire. And they themselves came at times to covet large portions of both the Roman and Sassanid empires. In the south, at the same time, peoples on the peripheries of the south portion of the Roman and Sassanid empires, the Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Horn of Africa, they began to develop their own very robust and expansionistic states. And some of these states include the Ghassanid kingdom, the Lakhmid kingdom, and the Aksumite Empire, or Aksumite really began campaigns of spreading. And we need to look at both of these in turn to kind of get an idea as to what's going on. So starting with the Germanic tribes. Germanic peoples had lived on the fringes of the Roman Empire since antiquity. In fact, the Germans had actually, one of the Germanic tribes had bested the Romans at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in AD 9. These were a militaristic peoples that they could give very well of themselves. And they often served as auxiliaries and mercenaries in the Roman Empire, even from an early time period. But over time, they came to represent the bulk of the regular Roman force. So by the 4th or 5th centuries, the Roman army was largely comprised of Germanic-speaking peoples. This included a lot of different peoples. This included the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, the Angles, Burgundians, Lombards, the Alemanni. The Alemanni is the tribe that gives in Spanish, right? The word German is Alemanni. That's where that word derives from. It's from this specific tribe, among many others. This is a slightly outdated image. In fact, this is an old version interpretation of Germanic migrations. If we were to turn this into modern day, first of all, the Huns are not Germanic; they're Turkish, and so they wouldn't be on there. But then also the Goths are shown as coming from Sweden. Most of the best evidence nowadays suggests that the Goths didn't come from Gothland or Gotland or from Sweden at all. They actually derived from the southern Baltic, from the areas of Poland, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture. But we can see that kind of spread over here. These German peoples raided throughout the empire. Most eventually settled in the Western Latin-speaking sections of the empire, which were sparsely populated and often undefended. And so you can see that here. The big movements that you can kind of see is, of course, if you're looking, the two big ones are the purple, which represent the Goths, and the blue, which represent the Vandals. The Vandals actually make it to Carthage, and the Goths, the Visigoths, the Western Goths, actually make it and settle in Spain. The Ostrogoths end up in Italy but don't last very long. We'll talk about why that is in the next slide. Well, the next slide after this one, I should say. During this migration period, Rome was sacked a number of times. The most famous was under Alaric, who sacked Rome in 410. However, a much more violent sacking occurred by Geisereric of the Vandals in AD 455. And then the last major sack by the Ostrogoths under Totila occurred in AD 546. So Rome was sacked multiple times. It's important to note that by the 5th century, when these sacks occurred, Rome was not the capital of the Roman Empire. It wasn't even the most important city. In fact, the most important city in the West by this point was probably Carthage or Ravenna, depending upon how you look at it. Most of the political institutions were centered in Ravenna, but the economic power, the important grain, the control of grain shipments and things like that, those are all coming out of what the Romans called Africa, or what we would call today Tunisia, in the Carthage area. So those areas were much more important. In fact, the Vandals actually conquered Carthage, which was part of the problem. The most important, perhaps, one of these migratory periods was a group known as the Franks. From the 3rd century, that crisis in the 3rd century, the Gallic Empire transitioned from part of the Roman Empire to part of the Western Roman Empire to the kingdom of Soissons before being conquered by the Franks under Clovis in AD 511. These Franks adopted Christianity. I mean, in fact, we can see Clovis here being Christianized. He's getting baptized in the image we see. And would adopt Latin culture and Latin language. In fact, French is a mixture of the Germanic tongue and Latin. And ultimately, this kingdom of Francia would be recognized as the Holy Roman Empire in AD 800 with the crowning of Emperor Charlemagne. Latinization didn't just happen to the Franks. It happened to a lot of different tribes. So as these German groups came in, they adopted Christianity and the Latin language. Visigoths became Spaniards. Lombards became Italians. And in fact, you can still see the influence of these peoples in these countries today. Lombardy is northern Italy. And if you go there, the people of northern Italy look much more Germanic in their appearance. They tend to have fairer colored hair and fairer colored skin compared to the southern Italians. A similar trait occurs in Spain and the northern highlands of Spain. These people tend to have more Germanic characteristics. And these Germanic tribes often maintain, even though they took a lot of these Latin ideas and this Latin language and this Latin religion with them, they really kept a lot of their military prowess and social political institutions, especially oaths of fealty, which provided the backbone for later feudal systems in the medieval period. Now, all of this stuff was going on, and some people ask, well, why didn't the Romans try to stop it? I mean, why did they just let their empire fall apart? Well, they didn't. Well, at least there's one guy who didn't. The man you see before you is often known as the last Roman. This is the Emperor Justinian I. He took over as emperor in AD 527, and he thought Rome should include the western provinces. So even though most of the western provinces are gone, by the time he comes to rule, he decides that he's going to take back the empire. And so after a short war with the Sassanids and a bribe to secure peace, he sails west with his armies, or he has a general by the name of Belisarius sail west. And through the process of wars with the Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths, Justinian was able to restore much of the Roman Empire. So this is Justinian's empire in AD 555. It looks pretty good. It doesn't include those areas lost to the Franks. It doesn't include most of northern Spain, but it does include large portions of North Africa, including the important port of Carthage. It includes the Italian peninsula, including Milan. It includes Rome. It includes Milan on there is Mediolanum. Sorry, that's my pronunciation. It also included the southern portions of Spain, which we would know as Granada, mostly portions of Granada today, but included New Carthage or Carthage Nova. It included most of the big cities in Spain that had been Roman cities. However, this reconquest couldn't have come at a worse time. In fact, before the reconquest was done, the Romans were already once again at war with the Sassanids. Also, this period also has the horrible notion of most historians agree that if there was one time, the most terrible time to be alive was probably during Justinian's reign. We don't know exactly which volcano blew up. Some people think it was a volcano in Iceland, but they had years where nothing grew. And it wasn't just in Europe. Chroniclers in China actually mentioned that it never got warmed those years. Nothing ever grew those years. And it was the first outbreak of bubonic plague. And these really just made the populations in the Roman Empire just decline so quickly it wasn't even funny. To make matters worse, a lot of these peoples he reconquered, especially in Italy, the Romans had not been part of the Roman Empire for so long. They had grown unaccustomed to paying taxes. So, he had this empire and he had these wars, and of course he taxes his subjects to pay for these wars. When he reconquers these areas, he's like, you guys are going to pay taxes. And nobody wants to pay taxes, and they revolt. In fact, the only areas Justinian's able to hold on to are those areas of former Greek and Phoenician colonies. So he can't convince the Latin peoples to go back into the Roman Empire. He manages to keep Sicily. Sicily had been part of Greek culture, and southern Italy, which had Greek colonies in it, and in North Africa, which had Phoenician traditions. I should be clear. Carthage was initially a Phoenician colony. Southern Spain had Phoenician colonies. These are areas that today we know as Tunisia, Sicily, and Granada. These areas stayed a part of this Roman Empire, at least for the time being. But he wasn't able to take it all back. Also, at around the same time, Turks arrive. The Turks appear on the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the 4th century, replacing the Iranian-speaking peoples that are there. These are powerful horse archers that introduce the stirrup to the Romans and Sassanids, and they come in waves. So these Turkic peoples, the first ones that arrive are the Huns, but then after the Huns are kind of defeated, another wave comes to challenge them, and these are the Avars, and then the Bulgars, and then last the Khazars. So every time they appear to dispatch, the Romans and Sassanids tend to quell one of these Turkic groups. Another Turkic group emerges on this steppe. It comes from somewhere in Central Asia. In fact, the just so story, right, is that, you know, if you want to tell a just so story, right, the Turks come because China builds the Great Wall. You know, the Huns are messing around in China, or the people that we know as the Xiongnu in China, or you know, attacking the Chinese. They build the wall, and for whatever reason, they rush to the west. That's probably not entirely true. There's no clear consensus of the origin of the Huns, really, but the Huns were bad news, and they were first of many. And it's important to note that while we tend to think of the Huns in the West, we go, oh yeah, Attila was really bad. There were two other Hunnic groups that were also called Huns that were actually even more of a problem for late antiquity. The Eastern Huns, known as the Red and White Huns, and these may not even have been Turkic-speaking peoples. We know very little about them. They're also known as the Kittites and Hephthalites. These guys invade the area of the Eastern Sassanid Empire, and they kind of get into the places of what we would call today Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they get into the areas of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. And what they effectively do is these Huns cut off the Sassanid and by extension the Roman Empire from the Far East. So prior to that time, trade had been going along those Silk Roads. The Sassanid Empire had grown wealthy off trade with China, with India, and during this period of late antiquity, the constant flow of traffic between these two areas, the East and the West, kind of stops with these Huns coming in. Now, the Romans and Sassanids fought the Turks, at least initially. They fight them, and when they realize they can't fight them anymore, they resort to paying them tribute before ultimately bribing them to fight for them. In fact, by the 7th century, the Avars are financed by the Sassanids to raid the Roman lands, while the Bulgars are given wealth by the Romans to attack the Sassanids. So the Turkish peoples were literally used as buffer states in which the Sassanids and Romans could play out their own wars. So they encouraged these Turkish peoples to attack these larger empires, and to great success, I might add. The Avars were devastating against the Romans. The Bulgars handed the Sassanids massive defeats in the Caucasus. They were terrible people. Now, these are not the Bulgars where you think the Bulgars are today, but these are people actually more closer over towards the Caucasus in Russia, or even the Eastern Crimea is probably the best way to put it. They're in the Eastern Crimea, not in Europe at this point. And the last group of these guys are actually really interesting. The Khazars are the last of these ogre-speaking Turks. There's multiple Turkic languages that are all slightly separate from one another. This is the last of the great ogre-speaking Turkic migrations in the West. And the Khazars were really important, and they adopted Judaism. And they adopted Judaism as a means of centralizing sacred and secular authority, but also as a tool to distinguish themselves from other groups. In fact, a lot's made of the Khazars today. A lot of people want to take the Khazars and make the case that the Khazars are the origins of the Ashkenazi Jews in Europe today. That's probably not correct, but they were the most important Jewish state during late antiquity. They also signify really a greater issue which is going on here, which is religion as a weapon. we're in an era where states were multi-ethnic, and there's no national identities back then. State religion was able to unify lots of different peoples living in these empires and provided a justification for war and expansion. And while this idea was embraced by the Romans and the Sassanids, and of course, as we saw just a moment ago with the Khazars, the Turks, it really hit its full realization along the southern periphery. So we'll turn to the southern periphery. So in the south, the Sassanid and Lakhmid kingdoms were clients of the more powerful Roman and Sassanid empires. Just like the Turks, the Avars were financed by the Sassanids. Well, the Lakhmids were financed by the Sassanids, and the Ghassanids were financed by the Romans. These are states that were kind of in their spheres of influence. And if we look at where those states are today, we'll notice that they butt against each other. So it actually gives a second front to the war with the Eastern Roman and Sassanid empires. And both were Semitic-speaking Arabs. Both were ruled by Semitic-speaking Arabs. The Lakhmids embraced traditional Arab paganism, while the Ghassanids adopted Christianity. But there were other Semitic groups in the area. The most important Jewish state in this region was the Himyarites. They're down there in that kind of southwestern portion of the Arabic Peninsula. And they chose to adopt Judaism. So there's a lot of different religions going on. But the most important of these states, at least for our narrative, was the Kingdom of Aksum, which is slightly called different. It can be spelled a lot of different ways. Aksum had existed as a pagan state since at least 100 BC. But in the 4th century, it adopted Christianity and began an aggressive campaign of expansion. Today, the Aksumite kingdom, we tend to link it with Ethiopia. It was actually located over portions of the Sudan, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So you can kind of see the spread of the Aksumite kingdom on the slide. The Aksumites initially expanded north along the Nile, destroying the pagan kingdom of Kush and inadvertently creating the Christian kingdoms of Nubia. Those represent Nabatea, Makuria, and Alodia. Those kingdoms would go into the Middle Ages. But after that initial expansion and Christianization of the peoples to the north of them, they moved across the Red Sea and onto the Arabic Peninsula, where they conquered the Judaic Himyarite kingdom in Yemen. So the Jewish kingdom is collapsed by the Aksumites. In this later conquest brings them in obviously direct competition with the Sassanid Empire, who looks at the Arabic Peninsula as part of their sphere of influence. And the Aksumites get really focused. This Christian group in the Horn of Africa gets really focused on an area that we call the Hejaz. In this area, there's a large city known as Mecca. And in the middle of Mecca is this shrine known as the Kaaba. Now, today the Kaaba is sacred to Muslim peoples. At this point, there is no Islam. In fact, the Kaaba is a location where the Arabs, who are still pagans, they worship lots of different deities inside the Kaaba. So there's all sorts of gods in there, one of which is called Allah, to be clear, but it was one of many gods associated with them. And the Aksumites looked at this as, they looked at the conquest of Mecca as a way to spread Christianity. And there were certainly Arabs in the region who wanted them to come in. And the Arabs, remember, there were monotheistic Arabs, and then these monotheistic Arabs didn't like the Kaaba either. And so they encouraged them to invade. And so the Aksumites did. In fact, they send an army of 40,000 men to destroy Mecca. And it's really interesting. Their general, Abraha from Aksum, he actually comes from Yemen with his army. So the army that they brought into the Arabian Peninsula is actually the army that does it. He rides upon a white elephant, which is very impressive to the people. And there's a great story that the year, which we're not entirely sure what year it happened, but it's been tied to the year 570, which became known as the year of the elephant. Unfortunately, most of the local Arab tribes united against the Oxamites, and likely with the aid of smallpox, were able to prevent the conquest of Mecca. In fact, in the folklore, the general gets right outside the gates of Mecca, and the elephant isn't able to. The elephant stops at the gate. It won't let him enter Mecca, like it's sacred and protected. And then a huge flock of birds, and I'm probably not telling the story perfectly right, but I think it's close enough. Huge flock of birds flies from the sky and pecks at all the Oxamites, who have all these little blisters on their skin afterwards. Most people think it's an outbreak of smallpox that actually destroys the army and causes them to flee. But certainly some of the Arabs unite against them. At the same time, the Sassanid army arrives in Yemen and chases the Oxamites back across the Red Sea. And the Oxum Empire, which is going to continue for some time and eventually emerge into the Ethiopian Empire, will retreat back onto the Horn of Africa. But it's during this backdrop of events that the Prophet Muhammad is born. Now, he was born in AD 570. And usually people place his birth at the same year the Oxamites failed to conquer Mecca. That's interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, Muhammad was part of a group of Arabs that actually sided with the Oxamites. So he would have loved to seen the Kaaba at that point destroyed for holding all those pagan idols. Because, of course, he sees a new way forward for Arabic peoples. And he thought his clan, the Banu Hashim clan, which sided with the Oxamites, believed that the Kaaba should be a center for monotheism. However, he was also a very bright man, and depending upon whether you believe in Islam or not, he's either way, he's a very, very bright man. Whether he had visions from God, that's up to your belief system. I mean, certainly, if we can believe other people have visions from God, certainly he certainly meets the criteria as well. But even if you don't believe those things, he had an incredibly brilliant mind. What occurred to him, either through visions or through his mind, was a form of monotheism that would work for the Arabic peoples. And this type of monotheism he develops is Islam. It expands upon Christianity and Judaism and explicitly combines the sacred and secular law, providing a clear impetus for religious and state expansion. So Judaism and Christianity, in general, I mean, Christianity was meant as originally formed almost as a religion of peace. And it wasn't tied to secular authority. The emperor had to kind of co-opt Christianity and make it into something that would work for him. Whereas Islam combined these two things from the very, very start. In Islam, what was this concept of jihad? It's often known as the sixth pillar of Islam. It's not really, but it's often viewed as that. Jihad means struggling for a noble cause, but it quickly gets associated through Muhammad and through his successors as associated with religious warfare. And it's the duty of every Muslim to expand the state. Holy warriors, known as Ghazi, we see lots of different types of holy warriors here in this image, would raid non-Islamic areas, softening the enemy up for eventual conquest. In fact, some people believe that I don't know if I believe this is true, but I think it's worth pointing out. A lot of people that study the formations of the Islamic State from the outside say the greatest thing he gave to them was the peace. The Arabs could no longer fight with each other. Because the Arabs had always fought amongst themselves, as we saw with these earlier kingdoms. I mean, the Arabs were divided and literally fought with each other nonstop. With Islam, they unified and they took all that aggression and that expansion in intertribal warfare and they spread it out, allowing the Islamic State to grow rather rapidly. In fact, here we can see the conquest, the initial Islamic conquest. We can see it spread across the Arabian Peninsula first, across the portions of the Persian and Roman empires quickly, and then into the west, into portions of northwestern Africa and into portions of Central Asia. Not only replacing the Persian, the Sassanid Empire, but also those Huns, those people that had been out there blocking things off, are also replaced with Islam. And in AD 636, the Islamic forces won decisive battles against the Romans at the Battle of Yarmouk and the Sassanids at the Battle of Al-Qaadisa. And I'm probably pronouncing that badly, and I apologize. The Romans decline as a result, but the Sassanids pretty much collapse. The Sassanid Empire is completely wiped out by the Arabs. And this is not unexpected. Here we have the Arabs destroying the Persians at the battle in 636. We have pretty much the fall of the Sassanid Empire here, depicted in this modern day drawing. For 4 centuries at this point, the empires of the Romans and Persians, the Sassanid and Roman empires, had suffered economic decline and territorial decline at the hands of the Germans and Turks, while their armies constantly battered each other. When these battles occur in 636, these empires are poor facsimiles of the states they'd once been. These are not the Roman empires of glory days or the Persian Empire of glory days. These are empires that pretty much are running on fumes at this point as they continue to fight each other. And Islam just puts the nail in the coffin. Interestingly enough, Islam was not stopped by the Romans or the Persians. It would be halted, though, in the 8th century. The first halting was outside of Constantinople in 718, in which an army of Bulgars, now living along the Danube River, where you think of Bulgaria today, under Khan Tervel, actually crushed them. They crush the Bulgars at this point are pagans, but their Turkish army destroys the Arabs outside Constantinople in 718. They do it because they're actually encouraged to by the Romans, who at this point eventually call Tervel becomes a Caesar in his own right, which is interesting in and of itself. And then, of course, in the West, the Arab forces push up from Spain and into the heart of Western Europe, where they're defeated by Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, who we see here in this picture, defeating leading his Franks to victory at the Battle of Tours in 732. And of course, at this point, it should be noted that this conflict between the Arabs, the Germans, and the Turks, or between the Semitic, Germanic, and Turkic peoples, would come to define the medieval period. Starting with the Franks and these other Germanic peoples, they would militarize Christianity and push back against Islam. With the Crusades in the Middle East, with the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula. At the same time, other Turkic peoples would adopt Islam and ultimately supplant the Arabs as the rulers of much of the Middle East. The Seljuks would rule, a Persianized Turkish group would rule much of the Middle East during the medieval period. They would be succeeded by the Mamluks, not the Mamluks, by the Ottomans in Anatolia. The Mamluks themselves are another Turkish people, right? Turkish people come to rule Egypt. The Mamluks were actually Cuman or Kipchak Turks, a slightly different Turkish people than the Bulgars. Other Bulgars, interestingly enough, while those Bulgars under Khan Tervel would ultimately adopt Christianity, another group known as the Volga Bulgars would adopt Islam. And while all of this is occurring, Latin, Greek, and Persian peoples continued to exist and continue to play a role in historical developments, but they would no longer be the principal participants in world events. They would lose a lot of that power and force. They viewed themselves as the great empires and the great peoples of antiquity, and at this point they become more footnotes in history compared to some of these other new peoples. So I want to leave you with a couple conclusions, and I want to, first of all, late antiquity can be viewed as a continuation of the classical world, centered on the conflict between Romans and Sasanians, or as we would look at them in earlier antiquity, Greeks and Persians. However, on the periphery, things were changing dramatically. Germanic, Turkic, and Semitic peoples developed new expansionistic states that competed with these traditional empires. And the emergence of Islam was the defining moment, which ultimately led to a reconfiguration of the social order in the beginning of the medieval period. I think there's a lot of reasons why you would want to study late antiquity. First of all, it's easy to focus on the empires as closed systems and blame their decline. In fact, most of you that learned about the Roman Empire probably learned that the Roman Empire declined primarily based on internal factors. And they tend to focus on the history of these empires rather than examining the broader context in which these declines occur. In focusing on this talk on on this era of late antiquity, we see two large states continuing their historic rivalries with one another while the world changes around them. And the result is catastrophic. Lastly, I would point out that while I'm not saying we are living in late antiquity today, a new version of late antiquity, living in a post-Cold War era like we are is perhaps easy to see a similar situation unfolding as the United States and Russia continue their conflict with each other, both politically and militarily, to the benefit of other burgeoning world powers, as we've seen new nations become the primary players in world power. And next time we will join ourselves with a group of people I didn't talk about at all today, which are the Slavs and the emergence of the Polish state in the Middle Ages. But with that, I will open it up for questions.
Matt?
Yes.
What happened to the Khazars who converted to Judaism? Where did they settle and what happened?
So there is a debate amongst where they go, and it depends upon how you view things. What we can say perfectly well is that the Khazars, first of all, they never really, it should be noted that I think the argument that they were Jewish is slightly wrong. It seems that the ruling nobility converted to Judaism. It's not clear if all the Khazars actually converted to Judaism. It is very unlikely. But there is a Russian prince of Kiev by the name of Sviatoslav who comes in and destroys the Khazar state in the 10th century, so a little after our talks. And it's actually in the Russian Primary Chronicle, and it's like it's literally like less than a paragraph in which they discuss the destruction of the Khazar state. But what happens is he seems to attack the Khazars and do a crushing blow against them, but this doesn't really destroy them. What actually destroys them is that as they kind of fall apart, another group of Turkic people known as the Pechenegs and later the Cumans kind of come in waves and they just replace them. So within a century, the Khazars are no longer the powerhouse on the steppe, but they're a part of a greater Kipchak or Cuman confederation, which is going to prove to be a much bigger problem for the Russian states. Now, I say that in some people view that moment of the Khazars being pushed off the Pontic steppe as the spread of the Ashkenazi, the Eastern Jewish populations in Eastern Europe. The problem with this is that the genetic studies don't really back that up. So that, well, the Khazars were Jewish, they may not be direct genetic descendants of the Ashkenazi, which may have spread primarily through the Middle East. The Khazars were a Turkic people. Genetically, the Ashkenazis look more Semitic in their genetic makeup. And I'm not a geneticist, and I can't really get into those arguments. It's a bit problematic. The place we see the Khazars' legacy today, though, is in one of the tribes that they Turkified. So one of the groups that they Turkified, that they ruled over and kind of influenced, was a group of Uralic speakers known as the Magyars.
Oh.
And the Magyars end up, they're floating around in the Khazar plains with them, and they really Turkify, even though they don't speak a Turkic language themselves. And a couple of them, along with a couple of the Khazar groups, a couple of the the tribes within the Khazar Confederation move west, and they settle on what we know today as the Hungarian Plateau, or the oh God, what's the right word for it? The Pannonian Plain, in what we would call today Romania and Hungary. These Magyars are like the Khazars. When people ask them, "Who are you?" Their Khan, a man by the name of Arpad, says, "Well, I'm a descendant of Attila the Hun." Remember, these people all view themselves, these Ogre Turkic peoples, all view themselves as a continuation of the Huns. And the name kind of sticks. And it's really the reason why we call these Magyars Hungarians today. When we call the kingdom Hungary, it's not because they were actually Huns, they were actually Magyars, but they view themselves as a continuation of the Huns. And so the Khazar state lives on in these Magyars, which are actually it's very problematic, because we tend, linguistically, people tend to make a lot of issue with the fact that Hungarian and Finnish are very closely related. They absolutely are linguistically, but if you look culturally at traditional Hungarian culture, it is much more Turkified. It is definitely within the legacy of those Ogre Turk-speaking peoples, the Khazars, and the Hungarians are actually made worse, because they actually later on, the Kingdom of Hungary actually invites some of the Cumans, these Kipchak-speaking Turks, to also come in, which those Kipchak Turks are also, the Kipchak Turks were the guys who beat the when people say, when did the Mongols first suffer defeat? Well, they suffered at the hands of the Mamluks in Egypt. Well, it's important to note that those Mamluks in Egypt were imported Kipchak Turks. The Turks were by far and away the match that the Mongols, the thing that stopped the Mongols, just like it had stopped the Arabs centuries before from destroying Europe and spreading further west. It was the Turks. I do a separate talk specifically speaking about these different Turkic groups and how they play. And of course, it's probably worth noting, since I still have a sizable portion of people here still on the chat afterwards, that if you're following the actions of the Chinese government against the Uyghurs in China, those are also a Turkic peoples that have really been persecuted in China. Those Uyghur peoples are definitely part of this narrative. They are the people that remained further east, but they all played a very important role in history. And I know there are a lot of countries today, not just China, but portions of the Ukraine and portions of Russia, where these people still exist, where they're marginalized and viewed as an unwanted minority in these lands that they had traditionally inhabited. The areas that they occupy in China were areas that they had always inhabited. Only Chinese people, the Han, the ethnically Chinese people that we tend to think of today, only started moving into those areas relatively recently. These are the ancestral homelands of Turkic peoples, and still are.
Thank you.
All right. If there's no other questions, feel free to reach me on email. And next time I will talk specifically about my research in Eastern Europe and the rise of the Kingdom of Poland in the 10th and 11th centuries. And we'll show how the narrative at Poland actually mirrors my work at Hamas, how you actually have the exact same narrative that you have at Hamas happening in Poland. But at any rate, I'll talk to you guys later. Thank you. You've been a good audience.
Thank you,
Bye.
Matt.
Thank you, Matt. Bye.